Hello and welcome to the 2021 edition of the State of the Union organized by the European University Institute in Florence. My name is Luigi Narbone. I'm director at the Middle East Directions program here at the EUI, and I'm delighted to introduce the panel Engaging Iran, European Transatlantic Perspective on the JCPOA and Security in the Gulf. Joining us today for discussion is Ms. Marina Sereni, Italy's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, Said Kazim Sarjanpour, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran and President of the Institute for Political and International Studies in Tehran, Barbara Slevin, Director of Future Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council in the US, and Jost Hiltermann, MENA Program Director of the International Crisis Group. For those of you who are participating via the digital platform, please open the live discussion tab in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Here you can submit your questions for the speakers in the Q&A tab, but also you can post comments in the live chat. And last but not least, please use the hashtag SOU2021 if you want to tweet about the session. And now, before starting the panel discussion, I'd like to pass the floor to Paolo Magri, Vice President of the Italian Institute for International Political Studies, who's co-organizing with us today the panel. Thank you. And Paolo, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Luigi, and many thanks to the European University Institute and to the State of the Union for this warm cooperation. It's a pleasure to open this timely conversation on the future of the nuclear agreement and more broadly on US-Iran relations. As you know, the panel is organized by RomeMed, the joint initiative of the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and ISPI, which is now in its 7th edition and which this year will be held on November 4 to 6 in a hybrid format. As I was saying, this panel happened in a crucial moment. Negotiations between Iran and the other signatories have finally resumed and underway in Vienna, and we hope that a negotiated solution will be found given the need of stability in the region. It is in the recent interest of all countries involved in the negotiation. It's also in the interest of Italy, which has always been advocating for dialogue in the region. But on this note, I'm very happy to leave the floor to Marina Sereni, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, for her introductory remarks.
Thank you, Paolo. Thank you, everybody. Your Excellencies, Minister Sarjanpour, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists. It is a pleasure for me to intervene in this webinar. Once again, the Med Dialogue Initiative provides a unique framework for an in-depth analysis on current and future challenges in the broader Mediterranean region. Let me thank the Institute for International Political Studies and the European University Institute for organizing this event in the context of the State of the Union initiative. This seminar tackles the delicate and crucial perspective of regional security in the Gulf, and in particular, the JCPOA that we do consider one of its main pillars. Allow me to briefly recall what the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is in our view. We consider the JCPOA a key element of the global non-proliferation architecture, as well as an achievement of multilateralism and multilateral diplomacy, endorsed by the UN Security Council Resolution 2231. The JCPOA was agreed in order to ensure that Iran's nuclear program remained exclusively peaceful in return for the comprehensive lifting of related UN, multilateral and national sanctions. Under the monitoring of the International Atomic Agency, the JCPOA has proved its effectiveness. Preserving the JCPOA is crucial not only in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, but also for the security of the region. Therefore, the intention to return to the deal and to its full compliance, stated respectively by the Biden administration and Iran, is highly welcomed. The new US approach also marks an extremely positive realignment between the two sides of the Atlantic on this crucial topic. The substantive discussions in Vienna among the JCPOA participants and separately with the United States represents a very important development aimed to find a diplomatic solution to restore the nuclear deal and ensure Iran's return to full compliance with the JCPOA. We are convinced that this is the right track. The road is still long, but the only solution lies in diplomacy. All sides should preserve the space for these discussions, and any action that could increase tensions and derail this positive process must be avoided in this critical juncture. The sequencing of measures to be adopted in order to revitalize and restore the JCPOA is certainly one of the most sensitive issues at stake. Nevertheless, an effective dialogue needs to be matched with Iran's clear manifestation of political will to fully comply with the obligations arising from the JCPOA. Unfortunately, some recent decisions regarding Iranian nuclear program can jeopardize the constructive spirit which is essential for progress in negotiation. In this context, the EU is playing a visible and firm role in safeguarding the deal. Italy fully supports the efforts of the EU High Representative as JCPOA coordinator with all relevant partners. Further, EU engagement in the context of a renewed cooperation among EU, US and Iran may significantly contribute to address major obstacles. The JCPOA crisis, as we all know, falls within a fragile environment characterized by volatility and tensions. In fact, we are all, as members of the international community, seriously concerned by the situation in Yemen, which is deteriorating day by day, by the persisting instability and insecurity in Iraq, by the ongoing crisis in Syria, and by the low-intensity maritime confrontation in the Gulf. We are convinced that the resumption of a constructive interlocution between Iran and the US would certainly have a positive impact on all these contexts, since it would remove a substantial source of mistrust among key players. Bearing that in mind, we believe that the revitalization of this dialogue should be, at this stage, the focus and the priority of diplomatic action. Moreover, we acknowledge encouraging signals of a possible positive dynamic in the area. On one side, the reconciliation within the Gulf Cooperation Council sets the conditions for a renewed collaboration among countries of the Arabian Peninsula. On the other side, the Arab-Abraham agreements open up new perspectives for dialogue and collaboration among regional actors. More recently, we have been also observing encouraging attempts to resume interlocution between Iran and the Arab monarchies of the Gulf. All the developments I have mentioned before must be read not only in terms of regional proximity, but also in terms of shared interests. Instability, sustainable resource management, freedom and security of trade and navigation, response to global challenges, starting from the fight against the pandemic. Re-establishing mutual confidence is the key to face problems and to take advantage of opportunities that go far beyond national borders, cultural differences, and religious distinctions. In the long term, it could also contribute to make progress on a comprehensive regional security framework in the Gulf. In this vein, a full return to the JCPOA would represent an injection of trust and goodwill, which is extremely important for creating the conditions for a more stable and structured dialogue in the area. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister Sereni. We can now move to the panel discussion. As we heard in the introductory remarks, indeed we are witnessing a very volatile situation after the US withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018 and launched the maximum pressure campaign. We have seen an increase in the Gulf insecurity in the Gulf region. There has also been a resumption of Iran nuclear activities coupled with escalatory dynamics in the regions. And we have seen some degree of disalignment between the EU and the US in the policies towards Iran. The election of Joe Biden seemed to have brought diplomacy back to the fore. The US has stated its intention to revive the JCPOA, and there is a newfound transatlantic cooperation engaging Iran on both the nuclear dossier and on the regional security. We are seeing the first sign of progress in the ongoing JCPOA talks in Vienna, and discussion focuses on the sequences of US and Iranian full return to the JCPOA, but also on how to disentangle the nuclear file from the broader regional security issues. So we have a very distinguished panel today for our conversation, and also to bring us some European, Iranian, and US perspective on these issues. And I would start with Jost Hiltermann, asking more specifically on the JCPOA talks in Vienna. They seem to be proceeding well, and there is some degree of optimism that they may reach an agreement. How do you see the prospect of the talks, and what is the role of Europe in the revival of the nuclear deal? Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Narbone, and thank you to Paolo Magri, of course, and to ISPI and the European Institute for inviting me to participate in this panel. I would not characterize the talks as proceeding well. I would say they're proceeding, and that is already a great thing, I should say, but I don't think it's going particularly fast, or there is now a real prospect of a quick resolution and a return to the nuclear deal. I think the United States side would argue that the Iranians are slowing things down, maybe because of the Iranian elections in June. It's not really clear. Barbara may have another view or a view from Washington on that. And I think from the Iranian side, the Americans are not offering enough in terms of sanctions relief. They've broken up the sanctions in three parts: sanctions that can be lifted, sanctions that can be discussed to be lifted, and sanctions that cannot be lifted. And I think the Iranians are only interested in discussing the sanctions that cannot be discussed to be lifted. So there is a clear problem there. As for the European role, well, the Europeans have been a critical part of the original talks that led to the JCPOA in 2015. But in a way, it's also a bystander role, because the real confrontation is between the United States and Iran. And because these are indirect talks in Vienna, the Europeans are essentially carriers of messengers. And whenever they are in any party is in a position like that, it's inefficient. And miscommunications can happen, and in fact have happened in this case. So that is not good. But I do think that the Europeans are quite eager for the talks to succeed, and perhaps, and we can talk about it later, I think, to lead to talks on further issues, an expanded JCPOA or JCPOA 2.0, and maybe a JCPOA plus, which goes into the regional issues as well. The Europeans certainly are interested in that. But for now, the priority should be to focus on the deal that existed in 2015 and reviving it.
Thank you, Jost. Dr. Sarjapur, perhaps we can hear some Iran's perspective on this. Are you hopeful that the Vienna talks can produce an agreement in time to meet also Iran's deadline? And what are your views about possible obstacles? Is it connected? There are problems? Okay, let's move on, and then we go back to Dr. Sarjapur. Perhaps I'll move to Barbara Slevi on on the debate on the JCPOA in the US. Of course, we know that it's also, there is quite an important bipartisan opposition to the current talks on the JCPOA. And how do you see any danger that this may derail the revival of the nuclear deal? And what scenarios could then this open?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be on this panel. At the Atlantic Council, of course, we focus on what US and Europe can do together. So the JCPOA, I think, is a perfect example of that. There is some democratic opposition to the JCPOA, but it is not a majority view by any means. And the issue of the Iran nuclear deal, it's actually become more popular in the United States over the last 4 years. If you look at the opinion polls, majorities of Americans support this agreement because the Trump withdrawal and the maximum pressure campaign are perceived to have failed quite decisively. So I don't think this is a major factor. There are some efforts by Republicans with a few Democrats to try to perhaps put in some amendments to legislation that would require the administration to report to Congress. But the way the deal is structured, it really can be re-entered by the United States through executive orders alone. I think the problem really now is more on the Iranian side. And Joost Hilterman mentioned the upcoming elections. There seems to be some debate going on whether it is in Iran's advantage to have the deal restored before the June 18 presidential elections or afterward. Concern that somehow a quick return would benefit the so-called reformist pragmatist camp in Iran and would hurt the chances of hardliners to completely consolidate power in that country. So I think that's part of the problem. Obviously, the Iranians, by insisting on indirect talks, have slowed everything down. And there are also reports that there are disagreements over some of the advanced centrifuges that Iran has installed and whether they all have to be removed. So I think the issue is not just the sanctions and the buckets of sanctions, but also on the nuclear side as well. However, the talks are proceeding, and they can speed up if there is a political will on both sides. So I remain optimistic. I think there is an understanding that the return to the original JCPOA is basically the baseline for anything that is to follow. We have seen some encouraging developments, and I think Professor Narbone, you mentioned it in terms of the regional conversations going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, other discussions between the UAE and Iran, the return of Qatar to the GCC fold, and just a general sense that that players there recognize that the Biden administration is not going to be the 911 every time there is an incident. And that they need a relaxation of tensions, and they need to do this on their own with the support of the international community.
Thank you, Dr. Slavin. And as you introduced the issue of the broader regional scene, I think I'd like to, Dr. Sarjapur apparently has still some connection problems, so we can perhaps proceed with our conversation. I will go back to Joost Hilterman and just ask him, how do you see the possibility of opening broader regional talks? And is there a role for European countries, as we know that they may be facilitators initiating such a process? How do you see that?
Thank you, Luigi. I think there is an opportunity, of course, to broaden the talks, or broaden them to build on top of a revived JCPOA to talk about the regional issues. There is also the possibility of starting a regional process even as the JCPOA talks proceed, and to have the two processes, which should not be linked, to be mutually reinforcing. They could also turn out to be mutually destructive, but that is obviously not the aim. But to have the two processes, it should also be possible. Remember that originally it was Iran that was seeking a grand bargain. So it wanted to wrap everything up in one package. It was the United States said, no, that's not going to fly, that's not going to work. So let's carve out the nuclear issue, come to a deal on that, and then we move on. Of course, then when the deal was reached, things fell apart when a new administration came into the White House. I think now there's a recognition that the regional dimension cannot be overlooked, that in fact that was a weakness in the original negotiations. And so from the Iranian side, there should be no objection to that, but Dr. Sajadpour, who has just joined us, can correct me.
On what? I'm just corrected by technology. I was
nice to see you, Kadam. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Glad you could join. I'm just talking about the broader regional talks and when they should take place and whether Iran would be involved. My main concern is you know, it's clear what the Arab Gulf states and what Israel want from Iran. What is not clear to me is what they're willing to give as a quid pro quo. As far as the European role, I would say it is clear that without a US green light, at least, if not active support, the Gulf Arab states are not going to engage in serious negotiations with Iran. They need that protective umbrella, the guarantee of that. But that doesn't mean that the Europeans couldn't play a highly constructive role in this. And we've been, as International Crisis Group, have been pushing for that to at least have a core group of European governments that would kickstart a Gulf-based inclusive dialogue between the GCC and Iraq and Iran. And this is still in you know, initial stages, but it's being discussed, including in Washington, fortunately, also between Washington and the UN, certainly in European capitals. So things are moving, but I think we have a long way to go. And the question again is, should it start now? My view is yes. Or should it wait until the JCPOA is back in place? I would say, yeah, that's possible, but not preferred.
Thank you very much, Joost. Good afternoon, Dr. Sajadpour. I'm
Good
glad
afternoon.
you managed to overcome technological problems and you are here with us today. We started already the discussion and we'd also like to hear your views. Perhaps, as you've seen, the discussion has already moved to broader regional issues, but let's go back for a second to the JCPOA proper, and I'd like to hear your views about the prospects of the talks and how do you see them, and also in view of Iran's deadlines, the elections upcoming, and what do you think could be the possible obstacles from an Iranian point of view?
First of all, let me thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to see friends and colleagues, and sorry for a very technical problem, but your staff were so good and adept, and they could, by using different tricks, solve it. And really, they need appreciation. But with respect to what you asked, I think, of course, I give my personal view, and it's not the official view. I think the prospect is somehow showing a movement to, let's say, a better positioning. If I'm correct, reading the situation, we have 3 stages in the negotiation that's going on. One is, let's say, debating what to do. And I think and how to start, what to do, what should be the agenda. And I think it took a long time, but it worked. So debate is over. Second, I think stage was drafting. And when you enter the drafting period, it means debate has moved. And I think still this drafting, let's say a stage needs to be polished, but I think it's going on. However, there is a further stage, and that is decision to implement. And I think this is where there are, let's say, psychological barriers, there are political barriers, but however, it depends on the political will. of all sides, but I think mostly United States. Don't forget that the US withdrew from JCPOA, and I think there was a type of a sluggish process of, let's say, rejoining through EU, and still not, US has not rejoined, but I think this is a sluggish process, debating, having different narratives and so on, so forth has taken some time, but I think personally, I'm not, let's say, pessimistic, though optimism requires more work to be done. But the obstacles, I think, are of maybe different natures. One is this technicality of drafting, and making decision, but the position of Iran is clear. I think that the sanctions should be lifted, the US should return, there should be verification of the sanction relief, and simple. I mean, the Iranian position, I think, is very clear and simple. JCPOA, nothing less, nothing more. Clear. So I think overall, I hope I didn't consume so much time. I remain optimistic personally.
That is good to hear. There are optimistic views, and the process, as we know, is complex. Perhaps I would now move to Dr. Slevin, and just to return on the broader regional questions. What steps has the Biden administration taken to manage allies' concerns, and particularly Israel and Saudi potential or outspoken opposition to the JCPOA?
Well, thank you again. It's a pleasure to see Kazem Sajapur also on the screen. The Biden administration has been very methodical in its consultations, obviously first working with Europeans and getting on the same page with them. But it's also been very solicitous of Israeli views and of Arab views, but I think in a way that does not give anyone veto power over the U.S. decision to return to the deal, if the technicalities can all be finalized. And we saw this with the sort of hands-off treatment that President Biden gave Bibi Netanyahu. He waited many weeks before he called him after his inauguration. He has given a cold shoulder to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, but at the same time, he appointed an envoy for Yemen, who has been working very hard, shuttling around, trying to de-escalate that terrible conflict. There are reports that, of course, Bill Burns was in Baghdad and had some interesting meetings there. Our former Deputy Secretary of State, now the head of the CIA. We have had others who've gone to Lebanon. Certainly there have been consultations with Iraq. So I think that the administration has been very active. It's also expressed support for the Abrahamic Accords and the willingness of Arab countries to recognize Israel. But at the same time, none of these countries have veto power. They're consulted, but they don't get to tell the Biden administration what to do. And I think this is a very healthy restoration of US sovereignty, if I may say so.
Right, thank you. And staying on the same issue of regional diplomacy moving, I would like to return to Dr. Sajapur and ask, we have been reading reports about Iran-Saudi talks, the intelligence level. Can this lead to a resumption of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran? And more broadly, how do you see the prospects for regional talks in a not too distant future, as we started to discuss?
It's a very good question. Actually, on the talks, I cannot comment because of, many issues related to this. But I think on the prospect, you have to take into account that the Iranian position is clear. And I think this clarity helps us for getting a picture of what we want to really do. And I think we have been for regional dialogue for a long time. We have, our foreign minister has been insisting on operative paragraph number 8 of resolution 598 of Security Council, which clears actually the way for a regional dialogue. And the United Nations Secretariat is aware of the Iranian position. They have been in touch on this issue. And I think on many occasions, Iran has expressed its willingness for regional dialogue. And for this, I think there is a very interesting phenomenon you have to take into account. And it is the bilateral side of the issues. And now you have Iranian bilateral, a very excellent relationship with Oman. You have a good relationship with Kuwait. You know why negotiation in Vienna was going on last week. Our foreign minister was in Kuwait, was in Oman, was in Qatar, was in Iraq. So I think the pillar of any regional dialogue is bilateral in a way. And I think the more bilateral that we have, the better. I think the Saudi-Iranian bilateral also can be a very interesting pillar of this regional dialogue. And I'm thinking that nothing is an obstacle for, let's say, this bilateral dialogue between Iran and Saudi Arabia. If I mean, you look at the picture, you see that the interest of both countries is in a type of connecting on this issue. So to put it tersely, I think bilateral plus the international United Nations base is very, let's say, or the basis that can make us thinking of a regional dialogue. My personal view is that Europe can play a role here. This is my final point. I think how? Let's say by think tank level, you can have a regional, the same format, let's say in 598, started on the think tanking level. And I think good works have been done on regional security. Expectations should be managed. And I think the more we have informal, formal, informal, I think what is important is my final word, is to change the psychology from psychology of tension to the psychology of dialogue. And I think it's possible.
That is indeed a very important change that has to occur, and it seems that some steps are taking place, so that can lead to some hope. Now I would open the floor for the questions from the audience, which I don't see yet. And waiting for those, I would perhaps ask a question to all three of you, and remaining on the regional dimension. What would be? I mean, is there any? It's very complex, of course, but is there any low-hanging fruit, something that could help trigger the process? For instance, there has been talk about Yemen, that could be an interesting focus of more diplomacies. Just to listen to you, or you see any other possibilities to kickstart the discussion on some specific issues or areas? Perhaps Dr. Sajapur, as you start from you this time.
I think yes. My own experience suggests that words matter, and talks, let's say public talks, signaling and messaging on positive toning matters significantly. And I think this is a very, very important step. So if you don't use the words against Iran in the pronouncements of our Arab neighbors, if you see hints of, let's say, cooperation, of course, this is where I talk about psychology. The psychology of conflict would change. I think there is always a psychological component to any conflict and conflict resolution, and a component of psychological package is wording. So wording matters significantly, and I think if you decide not to inflame, let's say, the rhetorics, if you talk about dialogue, if you talk about cooperation, I think it's not a low-hanging fruit. Actually, it is a very significant, but very easily can be achieved.
Yes, it is indeed important, and we are witnessing at least toning down a little bit of the rhetoric. I don't know if Barbara or Jost.
Yeah, let me just also mention now that, well, COVID is beginning to subside, at least in some places. We hopefully will see more people-to-people engagement. I think there was an Iranian soccer team, if I'm not mistaken, that played some matches in Saudi Arabia recently. These kinds of things can really be helpful in terms of breaking barriers, cultural sports exchanges. I hope to see a resumption of track 2 dialogue and track 1.5 dialogue. We've not been able to have these meetings in person because of COVID, and we've all really suffered from it. As much as these Zoom meetings are a good substitute, it's not the same thing for being in the same room with people. So I think we should give credit to the Saudi Crown Prince for toning down his rhetoric in the recent interview that he gave. That was very striking, given the things that he had said about Iran before, and Iran reciprocated also with conciliatory language. So this is good. But Yemen is obviously a priority because of the great human suffering there, and I would hope that Iran would exert some influence with the Houthis to get them to stop their assault on Marib, which is devastating, and try to get the parties to the table and get a ceasefire.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I also want to echo the as low-hanging fruit, the issue of words. The lowering of rhetoric is really helps lower the temperature as well. In fact, I have a commentary coming out today that is called, the headline is From Diatribes to Dialogue, because that is really what it's about. As a first step, of course, and we have seen, as Barbara said, some really constructive steps in that direction in the last week. I would also say that anything relating to COVID, to climate change, there are common interests there that are not such hot political issues that can be addressed. I should add to that Saudi Arabia and Iran know very well how to do this. They have done it in the past, even since 1979, not only before, and so they don't need any instruction on this. It is something that they know very well how to do, and can do. Now, is Yemen a good case of low-hanging fruit? It's clearly a case that's necessary. I'm not sure it's low-hanging fruit, because I don't see why Iran would bear on the Houthis to find a political solution in Marib when the Houthis are about to take the place. That's not going to end the war. In fact, it may make talks even more a remote possibility, and so that's terrible for Yemen. But I find it hard to believe that the Houthis would cease their military effort when it's so close to succeeding. and I say this with great regret, because it will cause a humanitarian disaster. There's no question about it. But so is it a good case of low-hanging fruit? The only thing is that Saudi Arabia wants to get out of the war, but Saudi Arabia getting out of the war will not end the war. This is going to take more time and complex negotiations. In Iraq, there have been altercations between the United States and paramilitary groups, some of which have links to Iran. Can this improve? Well, until recently, that hasn't, and I assume that's linked to the nuclear talks in some way, or to whatever domestic agenda some of these groups have in Iraq. There's also Bahrain, there's Lebanon, there is Syria. There are issues where it is possible to lower the temperature, but I would go back again to first we need a sort of a rhetorical cooling, and then move on to some concrete issues and leave it to the two sides to figure out the best way forward.
Yes, thank you. Just to mention, we have an upcoming conference at the Med Directions discussing about just those aspects on the 20th and the 21st of May. It's titled "Where Do We Start? Designing Steps Toward the Regional Security System in the Gulf." And it's actually, we have also an upcoming ebook over the next week or so, just to look at what specific small steps could be taken by countries in the region to advance towards a sustainable regional security system. So we welcome everybody to our conference as well. And I have a question for Dr. Sarjanpur from the audience. Around which strategic issues could Iran and Italy develop a partnership? And do you think that eventual removal of the US sanctions may strengthen the relationship between the two countries?
Very good question. Actually, I had in mind to have two more points, and one point was about the role of Italy. I think before going to Iran-Italy relationship, I think nobody can underestimate the role of Italy in creating a space for discussion, for, let's say, cooling down, for creative ideas. Because Italy has a great respect in our country and in the region. And since Italy has not been involved in imperial designs in our surrounding, and also a good historical relationship. So the role of IPSI, Med Dialogue, and these settings are great. So I think this is in the context of the, let's say, regional dialogue. And now on Iranian Italy, I think, first of all, this is a historical relationship. And it has been a very friendly relationship even during the very difficult times. So this can be strengthened. I think sanctions somehow impacted this relationship, not in the terms of the spirit of Italians or Iranians to work together, in terms of making some impediments by the Americans. But I think Italy, even in this regard, can be a vanguard because I know that Italy, even during the difficult times, through its SMEs and small companies, really try to help. Now I think I hope there would be a better situation. So there is a strategic point in Iran-Italy relationship, and when we talk about Iran and Italy, it's not just a bilateral. It has, I think, regional implications. It has European continental implication. So it's great. Now, my final point, I think the role of Iraq also should be appreciated in any regional dialogue. First, I think Iraq is a part of any regional negotiation. In the past, there was a tendency in some of the Arab states to ignore Iraq. I think if you want to have a regional dialogue, Iraq should be taken more seriously. And I think Iraq has a great capacity, potentiality, and also desire to act. And I think furthermore on reducing tensions in Iraq can really play a significant role.
Thank you, Dr. Sarjanpour. I have another question for Barbara Slavin, and it's interesting. As I said, it's what is if the next U.S. president withdraws again from the JCPOA?
Yeah. Well, look, it's a legitimate question, and obviously none of us anticipated that we would get a Trump administration that would pull out of the JCPOA so quickly. There are no guarantees in this world. I mean, Iranian policies can change, American policies can change. I think the best guarantee is a swift return to the original deal, strict compliance on all sides, and a diminution in tension in the region, and also, frankly, bilaterally between the United States and Iran. A release of hostages, of prisoners, a refraining from arresting more innocent Americans and dual nationals, which has done a lot of damage to Iran's image in the United States, going back to the original hostage crisis of 1979 to 81. And frankly, I think the time is long overdue for a restoration of normal diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. Both countries have been hurt by the lack of official channels, by having to go through go-betweens. The Swiss are wonderful, but it's not a substitute for direct relations. The taboos were broken by the original JCPOA talks. We had Javad Zarif and John Kerry negotiating. So let's build on this, and let's have a proper relationship that allows us to tackle other difficulties, including the primary US sanctions, which have deprived Iranians of many wonderful US products over the years. That's my personal view. I'm not sure if politically it can fly in Tehran, but I think it's about time.
Thank you. And we have one last question. I think time is running out for Joost Hilterman, and it concerns the why do Middle East regional powers do so firmly object to the JCPOA, and what can be done perhaps to smoothen some of these objections?
Well, I think there's a difference between Israel on the one side and the Gulf Arab states on the other when it comes to the importance of the JCPOA. For Israel, they see the Iranian nuclear threat as something that is directly directed at Israel, and it threatens them. Rightly or wrongly, but that is the perception. And so they focus on the JCPOA. Of course, in addition to that, they're also concerned about Iran's regional power projection, its the conventional missile capability, and its use of allies, non-state actors in the region. For the Gulf Arab states, it is mostly the latter. It's the regional power projection that is the most threatening in their perception from the Iranian side. And so for them, the JCPOA talks miss the point. They wouldn't like Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but that's not they don't think Iran will get it anyway, because the United States will block them or Israel will block them. For them, it is, why aren't you also talking about this issue that directly threatens us, which is what Iran is doing in Yemen and in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and in Bahrain and in the Horn of Africa and everywhere else, wherever they see something moving. So that is the reason. But I think the Saudis and the Emiratis can live with the JCPOA. They just don't want it to end there. And the Israelis, are divided. There is in the security establishment, there are quite a few voices that like the JCPOA, that might want to see an improvement in the JCPOA, but on the political side, that is an entirely different kettle of fish, and then it becomes an election issue and a political issue generally that certainly Mr. Netanyahu has exploited to the hilt.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, we come to the end of this very interesting panel. I'm sure we could have continued discussing for another hour or so, but that's the time is rather strict. And so I thank all the distinguished panelists for contributing to this very lively discussion. And I thank everybody for watching us. And stay tuned for the next Fringe event, which is titled Trends and Shifts in Global Governance and the Role of the EU, featuring the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System and Trigger, and which will start at 17:55. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.